lesson in web development. Given that we've explored most of the concepts in front-end web development as well as PHP, the only missing piece to the puzzle is databases. And in today's lesson, we are going to focus on an introduction to SQL databases. Now, with that said, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. First of all, we're going to explore the concept of databases, which is key when it comes to managing data on any system. Then we'll move on to defining SQL, otherwise known as SQL. And then lastly, we'll set up a SQL database. So what exactly is a database then? Well, essentially, in a nutshell, a database is a collection of information and data. Data here means that data is essentially just raw facts such as numbers and characters and so on, whereas information is actually what we can infer from a bunch of data. So in order to formulate information, we first need data. Data therefore serves as an input to information. Now, databases are often stored on a server, much like when we worked with XAMPP in a previous lesson to install a locally hosted server. Databases are often included in the infrastructure. We also use databases to store and manage data. And this brings us to the last point, in that databases allow us to perform CRUD operations. But what exactly are CRUD operations? Well, the word CRUD here is actually an abbreviation for certain operations that we can perform on a database. Let's explore this in greater detail. First of all, we have the create operation, which allows us to create data from scratch. We also have the read operation, which allows us to simply read data without altering existing data. This brings us to update. An update allows us to alter, manipulate, or change existing data inside of our database. And then lastly, delete is a simple operation that allows us to delete data from an existing database. Wonderful. Now, if you remember from a previous lesson in web development, we refer to this thing called the three-tier client-server architecture, and we'll simply revisit this to better understand how databases work inside of the client-server architecture. First, we have the web client, which is essentially our browser, such as Firefox as well as Google Chrome. We then request data over an HTTP request over the internet, and we make this request to our server. If our server has a database installed, or if the database is included in the infrastructure, we can query that database and then send the data back to the server, which will then be sent back over the internet to our web client. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, one thing that tends to come to mind is the importance of databases. So let's briefly explore why databases are so important. Well, first of all, it enables organizations to manage and store important data. Think of any organization that has a system implemented as part of their daily processes. Some systems might have databases to store data, which include things like employee data, sales data, transaction data, and so on. Another reason why databases are so crucial to the functioning of organizations is because databases host crucial information that provide organizations with meaningful insight. A typical example here might include an organization that needs to retrieve the sales per month or per week by retrieving data from that database and generating analytics. Now, because organizations are able to gain insight from data stored in their databases, this also allows organizations to formulate enhanced business strategy. And this brings us to the last point, in that databases also allow organizations to enhance the efficiency of existing processes that they might have in place. Now, when it comes to databases, generally speaking, there are several options available. But for the most part, there are three common types of databases often used on a day-to-day basis. This includes relational databases such as SQL or SQL. There are also NoSQL databases, which are quite popular when handling unstructured data. And then lastly, there are also cloud databases, and these types of databases are often hosted with service providers using their infrastructure. We mentioned SQL a couple of times throughout this lesson so far. Now I think it's a very good time to actually define SQL. So let's take a look. Now, SQL, otherwise known as SQL, is an abbreviation for Structured Query Language, and it was actually developed by IBM in the 1970s. It was the first commercial use of any database. SQL databases are based on the relational model, in that entities have some sort of relationship shared between them. And often we can use the relational model between things such as tables and columns and so on. And this brings us to our last point. SQL databases often consist of tables, rows, and columns used to store data, much like an Excel sheet, but with a lot more functionality. Now, when it comes to SQL databases or relational databases, there are several types of statements that we can actually use to perform operations on our database. And this includes statements such as data definition language, otherwise known as DDL. And we also have statements which include data manipulation language, otherwise known as DML. Let's explore these two concepts in greater detail. First, let's take a look at DDL statements. DDL statements are used to manipulate schema objects, and schema objects include objects which are better known as views as well as tables, for example. DDL statements also permits and revokes database privileges. For example, if you have several users with specific access to a database at specific levels, you could easily revoke or grant users access. And then lastly, DDL statement includes commands such as the create, alter, as well as the drop statement. Next, we have DML statements. Now, DML statements are used to read and manipulate the actual data stored inside of our schema objects. And if you remember correctly, schema objects are things such as tables or views. These are some of the most frequently used commands or statements when it comes to working with DML statements. And this includes the select, the update, the insert, as well as the delete statement. Now, with the basic theoretical concepts out of the way, I think it's time that we can start setting up our own database. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, setting up a database in XAMPP is pretty straightforward. Now, you do recall that when we were working in PHP, we actually installed XAMPP previously. So I'm simply going to boot up XAMPP over here, and I'm going to make sure that I start my Apache server. I'm also going to make sure that I have a MySQL service running, and these are the ports that I'm running these services on. Now, the next thing I have to do is actually access my PHP admin. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my browser, and I'm going to start typing in localhost. Now, remember, the one we are looking for is this one over here with this specific icon. This indicates to me that I'm working within my localhost. So I'll simply click on that. Alternatively, if this does not work for you and you're being redirected to a internet source like Google Chrome with a bunch of search results, there is another way to do this. So I'm simply going to copy and paste a website called localhost.me php my admin, and I'll simply hit run on this. And you'll notice that I have 3 links available to me at the top. First, I have this localhost with port 80, I have localhost with port 8080, and then I have this one at the top over here. Generally speaking, if you want to access your localhost, this link is going to assume that you're trying to target your local machine. So I'll click on this, and it's going to redirect me to my localhost, and that's going to be exactly the same as the one we have over here. So I'm going to close this off now. And the next thing I'm going to do is I have to actually create my database. So I'm going to click on this new tab over here, and this will require me to create a new database. So I'm simply just going to create a database called test, and I'll simply say create, and there you go. Now we have an official database, and you can see that it's actually been created over here. Now in this session, we're not going to do any coding just yet, because I think it's a good idea that when we start coding, we should probably dedicate a couple of focus lessons to our code that we're going to write inside of phpMyAdmin. But that doesn't mean we can't explore phpMyAdmin. So over here, this is actually where we create all our SQL statements, such as the create statement, the insert statement, and so on. And as we progress through the next couple of lessons, we are going to learn exactly how to create SQL code. You can also search your database. You can query your database in the event that you don't want to use SQL code. And if you want a user interface instead to do this, you can simply click on the query tab. Now, I'm a big fan of writing code, so you can probably expect that we will be writing a lot of SQL code instead of querying our database through the user interface over here. We can also export tables. We can import tables and databases. We can run specific operations like removing our database, renaming our database. We can also optimize the access or the privileges to specific users. And one cool feature that I really love about databases is that you can actually add triggers. And what triggers allows you to do is that if data is inserted into your database, then you can trigger some sort of event, like maybe insert a specific record into another table as a result of the first record being inserted. But let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet. In our next lesson, we're actually going to start writing SQL code. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.